Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dalaran, and Shamans have had their changes on the Shadowlands beta so far reverted in a recent build. They went back to Maelstrom instead of Fulmination, which the Maelstrom mechanic is something we are familiar with. While I was personally excited about the changes that Shamans were getting in this expansion, the fact that we're going back to Maelstrom does seem like Blizzard is pulling a ripcord on this spec. So, how do the changes with Maelstrom feel? Do they feel any better? Do they feel any worse? And where's Elemental Shaman currently? I want to take a look at the spec in closer detail, let you guys know some things that I like about it, some things that I don't, and kind of give you a little bit of a 1,000-foot view, at least from my perspective of where I think the spec is currently doing. So, by no means am I a pro at Elemental Shaman. If anything, I'm really excited about enhancement, but Elemental is one of those specs that I did enjoy back in Legion. I think Shaman overall for the last two expansions, in some instances, has been a very undervalued, actually kind of hidden good range caster. Not always is in the meta, it's not ever a Destro Warlock or a Fire Mage that everybody seems to want in the raids and dungeons, but it is solid, and it's actually really good when played right. So, looking into Shadowlands, I'm definitely taking a look at a considerable opportunity of playing Elemental Shaman as a ranged if I do pick up enhancement as a melee. So, how is Maelstrom affecting the recent changes that happened to the Shamans? I think it's fair to say that Maelstrom does smooth out the playstyle that Shamans have currently in BFA beta. By no means is Maelstrom the playstyle that I would want to have, but it is very smooth. We are used to it already, we already know how to play around it, and it's familiar at the same time, which probably is why it's so smooth, since we have been so used to playing with it for the last two expansions. I did like the ideas of Fulmination, however, and I really was excited to see where Blizzard was going to take it. Some of the things that I like about Fulmination was, well, first of all, you could cast your Earthshock and Earthquake anytime you wanted. And the Earthshock animation is actually quite cool. You never really get to see that massive impact animation that you get to see, but when it eventually got released on the beta, you could just spam Earthshock as much as you wanted. Not like you would actually spam Earthshock as a Shaman, let's say like in PvP, you're trying to kite away from the melee. You would probably end up spamming Frostshock, just because Frostshock does more damage. Where Earthshock was good in is after you build charges of Fulmination, which at one point in the updates, Blizzard had you do it through Lightning Bolts, Lava Bursts, as well as Chain Lightning. If Chain Lightning hits more than one enemy, you would build up Fulmination, and your Earthshock would release Fulmination. So it wasn't the Earthshock really doing damage, but rather the stacks of Fulmination that you built up from other filler abilities. Then there was Earthquake, which because of Fulmination, you could actually cast Earthquake from the very get-go. Like a mage would cast a Blizzard on the ground, you could just drop down an Earthquake anywhere you wanted, which I thought was a really, really cool idea. It actually had some uses. In PvP, it was invaluable. Let's say you're trying to look out for those pesky rogues in arenas, you could at least drop down an Earthquake in a random set position. And if you find the rogue because of this Earthquake, well, then you now stop the rogue's opener. You also could cast Earthquake on your position, on top of your healer or on top of yourself. So when the rogue does open, they're standing in your Earthquake. And while they're standing in your Earthquake, there is a small chance that they will fall over because of the knockdown Earthquake effect. This way, you would at least disrupt the rogue's opener in a small fashion. It's all, again, very RNG whether Earthquake does do the knockdown or not, but at least it was a chance to do it, and it was a cool way to kind of prevent rogues from having a proper opener. In dungeons, you could also drop down an Earthquake as your tank is about to pull a very nasty trash pack. Maybe it's a trash pack with a bunch of caster mobs that need to be interrupted. Maybe they do a powerful swing in front of the tank, debuffing them or reducing the armor. Being able to knock down some of those enemies in mid-cast or before they do their ability swing would at least give your group a little bit of a buffer to kind of realign and reset up their CC, whether it's AoE CC or interrupts. And the Shaman would open up with an Earthquake into a couple Chain Lightnings to build up a Maelstrom into yet another Earthquake right after. This way you could maintain this knockdown effect on the AoE trash pack if they were susceptible to CC for quite a bit of time. Earthquake Opener wasn't some kind of an overpowered CC by any measure, but it was really cool and unique to something that Shaman could bring. I love the ability for you to have the control of your abilities, whether it's Earthshocks or Earthquakes. Even if Earthshocks didn't really do that much damage by itself and did need Fulmination in order to do any significant damage, it was really nice to just be able to have that control of an ability. just being able to press it and there it goes off. So that whole mechanic of just being able to have more control and having those kind of levels to your earthquakes and your earth shocks is gone completely. Now you either have the Maelstrom or you don't to drop down an earthquake or an earth shock. But when you do drop an earthquake or when you do slam the enemy with an earth shock, those abilities are going to do a lot of damage. But I think because of this now, your earth shock goes back to being the hardest hitting ability in your toolkit. That's the one thing I didn't like about Elemental Shamans in BFA, is how it felt like your lightning bolts and your lava bursts and all those abilities weren't really the biggest hitter. And if it just felt like you were just setting up with another ability, setting up for something bigger, something greater. And that's the one thing that I liked about Elemental Shamans going into the expansion. It felt like your lightning bolts and lava bursts were finally worth anything. But right now, with the Maelstrom coming back, your Earth Shock, again, if it's a crit, does literally the most amount of damage. Right now, I tested on a train dummy, and with very base gear, my Earth Shock crits is about a little over 5,000 crit. This is currently the biggest amount of damage you can do in a single global, or in a single channel of an ability, or a cast of an ability. This is bringing back to the BFA playstyle, where now you're going to have to really save up for that single target, big punchy, big Earth Shock damage. Some people liked it, I personally didn't, and I liked having a lot more of these abilities that we have to be very close to each other to create more of the sustained playstyle rather than a very end of the line big haymaker burst at the very end once you build up the Maelstrom needed. Let's also talk about some of the talents. With the changes to Maelstrom, I feel like Elemental Blast as an ability has gotten worse. In the past, with recent other updates, we had Fulmination, which was the stacking buff, and when you use certain abilities, it would release the stacks of Fulmination. That means when you Earth Shock, it wasn't buffing your Earth Shock, it would let your Earth Shock go off and release the stacks of Fulmination. Same thing could have been done with Elemental Blast. You just replace your Earth Shock in the rotation, and Elemental Blast would give you a little bit extra of Haste, Mastery, or Critical Strike. But now that they changed it, right now each ability, your Elemental Blast and Earth Shock, has separate damage attached, since you don't now release this extra damage that's stored that's outside of your ability. With the Maelstrom, they made your Earth Shock do the most amount of damage, and therefore, since Elemental Blast takes less Maelstrom, it doesn't do nearly as much damage. This makes me wonder if Elemental Blast is really worth it. Is it better? I kind of like the other playstyle where you could use Elemental Blast to replace your Earth Shocks. I thought it was an interesting playstyle, an interesting interaction between those two abilities, but now it seems like Elemental Blast is just simply back where it's at. And funny enough, Elemental Blast gives you more Mastery, and isn't Mastery the worst stat for Shamans, which I don't really understand why they went with it. I think they gave you more Mastery, so when you do get the Mastery buff, it doesn't feel nearly as bad, but I just don't. I think they should definitely do something different with the Mastery for Elemental to simply make it better. Maybe do something to make it more consistent, or make more abilities work off of Mastery. Something about it just doesn't really rub me the right way. And then of course the talent of Static Discharge. This ability just feels terrible to play with. I tried it in a dungeon. I tried to keep it on cooldown as often as I could. Every 30 seconds you could do 6 hits. It does very minor damage to an enemy and will try to prioritize enemies with Flame Shock. Or you could simply play Earthen Rage. Whereas for your Static Discharge will be up every 30 seconds for 6 hits, while Earthen Rage will be there every time, all the time, 24/7. Even though Earthen Rage doesn't hit AoE enemies, and just like Static Discharge, it'll just hit one enemy. It's just one is active all the time, and the other is active every 30 seconds. I don't really know why it's there. I feel like if Static Discharge maybe had some Maelstrom generation potential, then it could be good, like something that you can use on the run to generate Maelstrom and do a bit of damage. Or maybe it's supposed to do a lot more damage, so it's a balancing issue. But I think Blizzard could do something more interesting with it rather than just, oh, let's just turn up its damage. What if they made the ability have like this arc in lightning, like the lightning will bounce to an enemy and then it'll just jump to a couple other enemies. Then it could be a good single target, maybe slash AoE ability, and have it generate a bit of Maelstrom on top of it. I think any one of those creative ideas would be a lot better than, well, what we have currently with this ability. There are also a couple talents that I think potentially could be based onto the spec. And I know that's like the laziest way of looking at it, like, oh, just make certain talents baseline and now the spec becomes better. Of course, I think there should be more creative ideas and new, fresh, exciting new passives and active effects that should be added to the specs. But with the expansion coming out in 2 months, what would be the fastest and easiest fix? I think something like Master of the Elements and maybe even Echo of the Elements are so iconic to the Shaman playstyles, and especially in the rows that they sit in, I feel like those abilities both could become baseline to, I think Master of the Elements could be baseline to Elemental, same as Echo of the Elements. But I think Echo of the Elements could also be baseline to Restoration Shaman, since we are on the topic. Master of the Elements is in a row that will mostly be focused on AoE damage. Storm Elemental giving you a ton of AoE potential, Liquid Magma Totem giving you lots of AoE potential, and Master of the Elements being the best single target choice with some cleave capability. Why can't this talent become baseline? As Shaman, you are Master of the Elements, and I think it would be a really cool mechanic to be base weaved into your playstyle. Between your mastery, that's not really all that interactive, but if you give it like this like Windwalker-esque type of extra passive effect that I think a lot of players do gravitate to, and a lot of players kind of like the back and forth combos that you can have with it. I'm a huge huge fan of Master of the Elements. I think it's a really cool playstyle that it offers to you with a pretty big payoff. I think it fits to the spec pretty well. Echo of the Elements is another one, just having to Lava Burst. I feel like in the end, we're just going to end up using that talent, especially with some of the legendaries that Elemental Shaman has, where an Earth Shock will give you a buff where your Lava Burst does more damage. Of course, it's a no-brainer. In the end, we are going to go for Echo of the Elements. So I think something like along the lines of Earthen Rage and Static Discharge in this like instant cast, maybe a passive type of effect, something could replace Echo of the Elements that would give you a second Lava Burst charge to your Shaman, again making you feel more like the master of all the different elements. Maybe Stormkeeper should also be baseline, or if anything, maybe Ascendance should be heavily buffed, and maybe unlimited power as well. I feel like Stormkeeper is just such a go-to talent for a lot of Shamans. There hasn't been a lot of situations where Ascendance has been the go-to play. I think right now in Battle for Azeroth, if I were to give it all the credit, with Vision of Perfection, you can play, I believe, maybe Ascendance, or maybe that's a playstyle with Storm Elemental and Unlimited Power. I could be wrong on this one. Maybe at some point Ascendance was decent in some cases here and there. Maybe with the legendaries that we have in Shadowlands, it could potentially be a decent playstyle for this big burst nuke. But right now it's one of its abilities that's still on GCD. It doesn't have any active effect as soon as you press it. If anything, it should at least be taken off of GCD, talking about Shamans off GCDs. But Stormkeeper is just such a dominant talent in this row. I feel like you either should really buff the other talents or just make Stormkeeper baseline and add something more interesting in that row. Again, not the most creative way of going about it, but with 2 months left for Shadowlands, this would be one of the ways to maybe fix the playstyle and make less talents feel mandatory for certain specs. In the end, I do think the Maelstrom change is helpful and beneficial for Shaman. If you're looking for something where there's smoothness to the playstyle, then I think Maelstrom does a decent job of it. Where I don't like about Maelstrom though is the restrictive nature that Maelstrom can create. I did like the idea of Fulmination replacing and becoming a major mechanic for Shamans, being able to drop down Earthquake whenever you wanted to, and even being able to drop down Earth Shocks anytime you wanted. I like this feel of you are the master of your elements. You can use your abilities anytime you want to. You are in control at all times. In the end, Elemental Shaman is actually quite a lot of fun to play. But I just think that all this progress that Blizzard have had with it so far, it just feels so bad to have so many updates in one direction and then just having to cut all these updates out all in a single go. It does feel pretty bad. It does mean that Blizzard has been doing all these updates for the Shaman and now they're having to take massive strides backwards, which if you are making changes in the wrong direction, you should stop them and go back as soon as you can. But it just means like all this development time, all this time spent trying to figure out how Shamans will play, now it feels like it's almost like wasted, I guess. At least that's what the feeling that I'm getting, just slightly. I was very interested to see what Blizzard will end up doing with Shaman with all these Fulmination changes. And to be honest, at first I was actually very excited about brand new updates and for Blizzard to be doing something different. But where we are right now with Shaman, they don't feel bad to play. I can't say that they feel awful to play, but there's not a lot of new there. And there are certain talents still to this day that don't either feel satisfying to use or feel like they're mandatory for the spec, which I don't think is a good thing. If I had to re-roll to another spec tomorrow, and instead of playing my Outlaw Rogue, I had to pick something else, Elemental Shaman would definitely not be in the top 5 of my classes that I would want to play as a ranged class. First of all, just about every spec of Warlock would be on the tier at first. mages, maybe even shadow priests for certain, even balanced druids. Shamans I think would actually be on the lower end of my preferred playstyle, at least in the moment. I do think Elemental Shaman is very underrated. Very, very underrated. It's actually super fun and super enjoyable, but with so many other changes that other specs have gotten, if you are an Elemental Shaman main, I definitely could see why you might have some class envy or spec envy. With all these classes getting so many good, stable changes, it makes you want for the same thing for Elemental Shamans to really be good. And with such short time left for Shadowlands, I just don't know if they will be at the top tier. Overall, Shamans have been suffering in BFA with very low numbers, and in terms of damage output, while beta is not the final and all be all, the low numbers isn't a good thing to look at least for as long as we've seen beta so far. And even with low numbers, at least Enhancement Shaman, if you were to compare them, at least Enhancement Shaman feels really, really good to play thematically in the playstyle. I think the changes the Blizzard has done have been better, and even if that spec did no damage, I actually would feel like I would have a lot of fun playing an Enhancement Shaman. I can't really say the same thing about Elemental, even though I really, really want to, and I think it's a very underrepresented spec right now, and I want it to be good. I can't say that I would have as much fun with it as I would with Enhancement currently. But thank you guys so much for checking out this video on Elemental Shamans. I'm really hoping they get some updates here and there very, very soon. I think with 2 months away, Blizzard can do plenty of things in order to help them out, but it's going to be all about listening to the community, changing up a couple talents, and maybe even making certain things baseline in order to alleviate certain issues that the spec might have. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Let me know what you think about Elemental Shamans in the comments below, and I'll see all of you guys in another video.